I was having trouble getting that stopped. That was a little highbrow music for you. Glad to see you back tonight for part 2 of the Desposyni and the disciples. This again will be full of primary and secondary quotes for you, quotes that you'll seldom find or read anyplace, because it seems that very few people are interested in the family of Yahshua, the early Nazarene movements, or where that movement ended up centuries later, these days anyway, because I think that some establishments of faith just have it all. But that, hold for another second here, let me find my notes. Oh, come on here. Here we go. Found them. Again, that word is desposyni, Desposyni. Anybody that knows that word, when you say it, they know exactly what you're speaking of, the descendants of the master. And now we're going back to a very early 2nd century historian. After we say a bit of a prayer, be with us tonight, O our Father, that we may use this information to magnify your name, spread your word, and bring love and unity to the family of Elohim. Amen. That is Hegesippus, or Hegesippah. He is a Nazarene. Of course, he's not alive anymore. He was a Nazarene of the beginning of the 2nd century. We would say probably the 2nd generation after the apostles. And he claims to be a disciple of the apostle John. He was born in Nazarene. He converted to Roman Christianity. We know not why. We know he lived from around 110 AD to 180 AD, 70 years. We know that he wrote 5 books of commentary on the acts of the ecclesia, of the church. 5 commentaries, they're now lost. But a few of the fragments are quoted by Eusebius in the Historia Ecclesiae. Among them is the following quote, ascribed to the time of the reign of Domitian, the emperor, 81 through 96. Domitian, of course, was the little brother of Titus, was the son of Vespasian. Titus and Vespasian, again, destroying Israel in that 7-year war, the revolt that is categorized in the words of Yahshua in Matthew 24. And I quote, "There still survived of the kindred of the master, the grandsons of Yehuda," that is Judah, the brother of Yahshua. Those 2 sons were named Yaakov, there's another James, and Zakar. Zakar is a Hebrew name. It means memory, or Yah's memory. So we have those 2 grandchildren of Maria, who, according to the flesh, was called his brother, that is Yehuda. These were informed against. Speaking of Yaakov and Zechar, the grandchildren, they were informed against as belonging to the family of David. The Avocatus, an Avocatus was a young man of the equestrian order appointed by the emperor to guard his bedroom. These were bedroom servants, these Avocatus or Vacatai. Brought these fellows before Domitian Caesar who was ruling 81 to 96, for that emperor dreaded the advent of Christos, just as Herod had also. Unquote. We don't understand today how dangerous it was in those days to be in the line of David or of the family of Mary. These folks were hunted down, informed on, and dealt with by the highest of government authorities, including the emperor himself, from the time of Nero in the 50s AD, clear up to the time of Decius in the 4th century. And not only these, but any claimant to the throne of David and anyone who wrote about them or even mentioned their names, they were informed on, they were brought from wherever they were to the governor, who dealt with them severely, usually by death, and even to the emperor, as we shall see, as we continue the quote from Hegesippus. So he asked them, that is, Domitian, the emperor, asked them whether they were of the family of David. So what's happened here is Domitian has set his eyes upon Judea, where these little guys were, and probably had them transported all the way to Rome. It's at least a 6 weeks journey by land and by sea. He asked them whether they were the family of David, and they confessed they were. Next, he asked them what property they had or how much money they possessed. They both replied that they had only 9,000 denarii between them, each of them owning half that sum. But even this, they said, they didn't possess in cash, but as the estimated value of some land, consisting of 39 plethra. Now, I don't know what a plethra is. Maybe somebody could look that up and let us know. 39 plethra. How big would that piece of land be? On which they had to pay the dues or the taxes. Taxes could be as much as 50% of what you made on the produce, and that they supported themselves by their own labor. And then they begin to hold out their hands, exhibiting as proof of their manual labor the roughness of their skin and the corns raised on their hands by constant work. Being then asked concerning Christos and his kingdom, that is the Messiah, what was its nature, and when and where was it to appear, they returned answer that it was not of this world, nor of the earth, but belonging to the sphere of the sky and of angels. It would make its appearance at the end of time, when he shall come in glory and judge living and dead, and render to everyone according to the course of his life or his works, just as it tells us in the end of Revelation concerning the judgment. Whereupon Domitian passed no condemnation upon them, but treated them with contempt as too mean, too low down for notice, and then they let them go free. At the same time, he issued a command and put a stop to the persecution against the assembly. Evidently, they were good witnesses, Zachar and Yaakov, or they were just people that Domitian felt no deal of fear from, or their dynasty, or their kingdom. Domitian just didn't let people go. When they were released, they became the leaders of the assemblies, as was natural in the case of those who were at once martyrs and of the kindred of the master, the Desposyni. And after the establishment of peace to the assembly, their lives were prolonged to the reign of Trajan. Trajan reigned after Domitian was murdered by the wife of Clement. Yeah, she was in on the plot. We'll talk about that later. 98 through 117. So these fellows could have lived as long as 117 as the second generation. The scions of Yehuda, brother of Yahshua. And that comes again from Eusebius in the Historia Ecclesiae, the history of the ecclesia, the church. And continuing in the ecclesiastical history, Eusebius records another account, this time the account by Julianus Africanus, a Christian traveler and historian. At that time, there were a lot of believers, especially Pauline-style believers, that had enough money to travel. And as they traveled, they visited the places all over the world that were considered to be holy places unto the apostles and to Yahshua, which included all kinds of shrines that were picked as shrines in Judea and Galilee. And they kept notes of their travels and of the shrines and the special so-called holy places that they had visited. Now, Julianus Africanus recorded the following concerning the family. For the relatives of our master, according to the flesh, whether with the desire of boasting or simply wishing to state the fact, in either case, truly have handed down the following account. But as there had been kept in the archives up to that time the genealogies of the Hebrews, as well as of those who traced their lineage back to proselytes, he's speaking of those Jewish people in the Bible who were looking forward to Messiah, and to those who were mingled with the Israelites and came out of Egypt with them. This is going clear back to the mixed multitude. Herod, since the lineage of the Israelites contributed nothing to his advantage, and since he was goaded with the consciousness of his own dishonorable extraction, Herod came from low class in Idumea. It just so happened that an Essene came upon Herod's father and gave him a prophecy that he would be high up in the Roman governorship of Judea, and somehow he became that, and that's how the whole dynasty started, with Herod Antipatris, the father of Herod the Great, and Salome, his sisters. All right, so our Herod, because of his own genealogy was so meager, Africanus says that he burned all the genealogical records, those who were kept in the temple, thinking that he might appear of noble origin if no one else were able to, from the public registers, to trace back his lineage to the patriarchs or proselytes and to those mingled with them who were called Gorai, G-E-O-R-A-I, Gorai. I can't find what the Gorai were, but evidently they were maybe another language, maybe the Latin, same thing as Desposyni. I just don't know. I couldn't find that, but I would sure like to know what that means. So Herod is destroying all the genealogical records, and you've heard about that from Josephus as well. He destroys them in order to make his greater. He wanted so much to be numbered among the great Jews of the scripture, but he wasn't a Jew, only a convert, and not a very good one. And then we go on with Africanus. A few of the careful, however, have obtained private records of their own. A lot of people today have a hobby of their genealogy, but if somebody at that time had a good genealogy, not only could they be exalted for it, but they could also be killed for it, especially if their genealogy pointed back to David. Either by remembering the names, they fixed their own, or by getting them in some other way from the registers. They pride themselves on preserving the memory of their noble extraction. Oh, I'd like to tell you where I came from, but I don't want to waste your time. Among these are those already mentioned, called the Desposyni, on account of their connection with the family of the Savior. Coming from Nazarah and Kokabah. That means in Hebrew, Aramaic, the star. Kokabah, there's a place in Galilee, a little town like Nazareth, a very small town. Coming from these places, villages of Judea, I'm sorry, but those places are in Galilee, my friend, into other parts of the world, they drew the aforesaid genealogy from memory and from the book of daily records as faithfully as possible. So these people, once their genealogies were destroyed, of course, they tried to bring them back. Same thing with the Jews or the Hebrews in the dispersion. All these records of theirs, their scriptures, everything was destroyed, and they worked their memories as best they could to bring them back and write them down. And of course, at that time, there was a great deal of history that is considered oral history, that each child was given to memorize when they were growing up at home and going to the synagogue if they could. They were given also their genealogies, if they had them, to learn, and the stories of Scripture to keep in their hearts. Now, I've got a little something here from Malachi Martin. You might have heard of him. I think probably his most well-known book was Hostage to the Devil. Malachi Martin died in about 85, I think, maybe a little later than that. He wrote many books besides Hostage to the Devil. He wrote a history of the Roman Catholic Church, and he was, in fact, a priest and high up in the Vatican hierarchy. This particular quote comes from The Decline and Fall of the Roman Church, a book I just got to get and read. And I quote, Malachi Martin, a meeting between Sylvester, I think that's Pope Sylvester I, and the Jewish Christian leaders. He uses the term Jewish Christian to speak of Nazarenes. A meeting of these took place in 318. That was just before Constantine and the Nicene meeting, in which the assembly was taken over completely by Gentile bishops. Okay, 318. The vital interview was not, as far as we know, recorded, but the issues were very well known. And it's probable that Yoses, or Yose, the oldest of the Christian Jews, Nazarenes, spoke on behalf of the Desposyni and the rest. Now, that can't be the little brother of Yahshua, because it was way, way too far in the future for him to still be alive, unless, like John, he could live forever or until Yahshua came back, okay? So there, he'll tell you a little later, oh, in the next quote here, he'll tell you why the names were repeated and repeated again down through the generations. That most hallowed name, Desposyni, had been respected by all believers in the first century and a half of Christian history. The word literally meant, in Greek, belonging to the master. It was reserved uniquely for Yahshua's blood relatives. Every part of the ancient Jewish Christian church had always been governed by a desposynos, that's singular. And each of them carried one of the names traditional in Jesus' family, like Zachary, that's Zachar or Zachar, the child of Jude, Yosef, Yochanan, Yaakov, Yosei, Shimeon, Matityahu, and so on. But not one descendant was ever called Yahshua. Now look, what happened here, maybe there's more, maybe I don't want to take this out of line. Yeah, there's a little more from him. This is important. Neither Sylvester nor any of the 32 popes before him, nor those succeeding him, ever emphasized that there were at least 3 well-known and authentic lines of legitimate blood descent from Yahshua's own family. 3 well-known, authentic lines of legitimate blood descent. I came upon something on those 3 lines just today. I didn't have time to study it out and share it with you, but there is a claimant, a man who claims to be a historian, that has been able to count the Desposyni that are still living today, people of the bloodline of Yahshua. And he says, there are 9,000, and I can name them. 9,000 today? Actually, what he said before is because there were so many offspring from that family that it seems that their descendants could be numberless. But here, this man has counted 9,000, and I can't wait. I didn't have time because I had to work tonight. I can't wait to see what he writes about here, see if there's anything to that. Probably not. You know, everybody's claiming to be a descendant of the Tsar of Russia or of the Queen or of somebody else these days. And mostly they don't get much play from that, but a few of them have, and have gotten great riches by either telling the truth about their descendancy or by lying. So the Desposyni demanded that Pope Sylvester, who now had Roman patronage, so the Romans were behind him, the church was behind him, they demanded that he revoke his confirmation of the authority of the Greek Christian bishops at Jerusalem, in Antioch, in Ephesus, in Alexandria, and to name Desposynos bishops to take their place. This is the see, the Desposynos, the leader of the Jerusalem assembly of Yahweh there at David's tomb, which we talked about last time. The bishop of bishops, the Mevakerim, right there in Jerusalem, of the family of Yahshua, demanding of the Roman Church and its Pope to let those churches loose from the bonds of the Greek Orthodox Church. Because Sylvester had just said to Jerusalem, hey, you're Jews, let's not even consider different. You are Jews, and you're not going to run the Church of God anymore. It's going to be the Greek bishops. They're taking over what you have, and you don't have any standing anymore. Okay, so the Jerusalem See had always received funding from the Roman Church. It was like, I guess, a museum. The Romans kept money flowing in so they could keep it going. I guess so. All the tourists that came down to Jerusalem in those days would have a chance to see the first heresy in action there in Jerusalem at the tomb of David in the upper room. So I'm going to read that again. The Desposyni demanded that the Pope Sylvester, who now had Roman patronage, revoke his confirmation of the authority of the Greek Christian bishops at Jerusalem. and there were a lot of them, as today. There are gobs of Greek Orthodox churches in Jerusalem, gobs of them. In Antioch, in Ephesus, in Alexandria, all three of those assemblies started out as, quote, Jewish Christian assemblies or Nazarene assemblies, including Ephesus. Paul didn't start that. John started that. James started that. Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch, that was the biggest one besides Jerusalem at that time. Antioch, Syria. In fact, that was known as Paul and Barnabas' home headquarters, as long as they had it. So the Jerusalem See is demanding that they take, instead of these Greek bishops, they put in their blood relatives of the master, just as the Jerusalem See had a bishop according to the blood of Yahshua down through that history until then. So their power, their authority in the name of Yahshua was pulled right out from under them. They asked that the practice of sending cash to Jerusalem as the mother church be resumed. And we continue. These blood relatives of Messiah demanded the reintroduction of the Torah, which included the Sabbath and the holy day system of feasts and new months of the Bible. Pope Sylvester dismissed their claims and said that from now on, the mother church was in Rome, and he insisted they accept the Greek bishops to lead them. Malachi continues, this was the last known dialogue with the Sabbath-keeping church in the East, led by the disciples who were descended from the blood relatives of Jesus, the Messiah. What a story. I've heard this, of course, before in my studies, but I never knew there was a direct quote about this. The rug was pulled out from under the Desposyni and the disciples, at least their descendants. So Malachi Martin, as historian, tells us that the members of the Desposyni were overseeing or bishoping the Nazorean assembly up to 312 AD. Again, that is just less than a decade before Constantine took over, before the Roman Church took the bishopric away from the Jews of the family of Yahshua. Well, and it's still that way. In fact, I saw on documentary a few days ago that the Greek Orthodox Church was trying now to acquire the Tomb of David on Mount Zion, which is the headquarters of the Jerusalem assembly since the time of the disciples, and the second floor of this is the upper room where they had their supper and had their meetings. So we've got the Greeks gobbling it up. And let me tell you another story here about, I was there a long time ago, and I was in Capernaum. Was it Capernaum? I think so. Right there on the Sea of Galilee. And they built a church over a synagogue there. There's ruins of a synagogue right on the seashore. Right across the street. What did they find? They found Simeon Kepha's house. His house. How do they know it? Because when they were digging through the rubble there of what that house was, and they got down into the basement quarter, they found graffiti telling them that Peter's place, well, actually his mother-in-law's house, and they found the different types of artifacts that would lead a person to believe there was a Jewish Christian Nazarene assembly right in his house. It's pretty obvious that there was, if the Bible can be believed, regarding Yahshua, the Nazarene assembly, leaving there, walking through the crowd that wanted to kill him, and then going to Peter's mother-in-law's house. All right, when I was there, I had studied beforehand in what to see in Israel. And there is a picture in my book, I still have it, it's called Jesus Within Judaism. It's a good book. There was a black and white picture in there of the ruins down in Peter's house basement. And the picture was good enough that you could see the graffiti on the walls and everything. And I thought, oh, good, I'm going to be able to look in there myself. There in Capernaum. I found it very easily. It was right across from the old synagogue. And what had they done? The Franciscans, Roman Catholics, had somehow acquired the property because they're rich. They're rich. And they had it all boarded up. You couldn't even get around it. But I had the picture. I knew what was in there. They had no sign on it or anything there. So we couldn't even see it. And now, soon after I was there, they built a church over that so people couldn't get in. They built a Catholic church over that that still looks just like the house of George Jetson. Really? Take a look sometime on Google. I don't have a picture of it. I would like to have one. So I'd like to show that to you if I can. Let me see if I can just pop in Peter's house. You can't see Peter's house. All you can see is George Jetson's church. Hold on, I'm running a VPN and I've got to turn it off or I can't get anything here. On. Oh, I've got the slowest internet. All right. Yeah, we got some pictures here. Let me show you. Okay. Here's the ruins. That's what it looked like when I was there. Just ruins, except it had boards over it and an orange piece of plastic around it. You couldn't get in there. I want to see if they show it to you today. Look at the, is that octagonal? No. Hexagonal structure. The sanctuary inside. This has been, of course, dug out quite a bit. Let's see if they show you the church now. Ah, here's George Jetson. I don't know if you can see that very well. Maybe there's a bigger one. There's an old picture, but you've got an idea. And while we're at it, let me show you a couple more pictures that have to do with what I've been talking about here. Give me a second. Please. Here's what David's tomb looks like today. Make this bigger. From one side, obviously, it's been done over since the time of Yahshua. But here's the inner court. Maybe these are all lined up well, and I can just go from one to the other. Here is, this bar is always in the way, the upper room, also called the cenacle. Beautiful place. Most incredible resonance in there if you're a singer, if you have a choir. Echoes beautifully in there. And of course, that's been redone by the Muslims. Right now, there's a fight to possess this property on Mount Zion. The fight's between the Muslims, the Israelites, and the Catholics again, like about everything else there. What else we have here? Here's the roof. This is the most impressive place. Oh, I'm sorry. It's just so hard to maneuver this Zoom pest. There it is. From the top side, these look like the cenacles, upper rooms. Cenacle just simply means dining room. And another from another angle. You can actually see the Essene Quarter down there. Yes, there's an Essene Quarter, and it's known as the place of James the Just's house. Said when they had recovered him at the bottom of the steps of the temple, they took him to his house in this quarter, where he rested and got ready for the trip to Jericho when Paul came after him. Well, let's see. This is the Essene Quarter here. If you know anything about Jerusalem map, down here at the very bottom, here's Beth So. That's the toilets of the Essenes outside the walls of Jerusalem. And this is where James' house is. And here's Mount Zion, the rest of it. Essene Quarter, James the Just. This is a picture of Pella. I'm going to get to Pella, not tonight, probably next time if you want to come. But since you already know what Pella is, this is on the Jordan near Pella, the place where the Nazoreans, when they left Jerusalem in exile, they came to Pella under the guidance of Simeon Bar Clopa, and they probably lived in caves. Sean and I last night were talking about the cave system back here, and when we get to Pella, we'll do a little more of that. Okay, we're going to do this next, probably. Stop share. So Malachi Martin, to sum this up, as historian and not exorcist, tells us that the members of the Desposyni were overseeing bishoping the Nazarean assembly in Jerusalem and elsewhere. Antioch, where else did I say? Antioch, Ephesus, one more, up until 312 AD, before the Roman Church took over. I bet they were madder than the Dickens. Hey, my little church when I was a teen was Evangelical United Brethren Church. And the Methodists came in and took over in 1968. And we were none too happy about it. We thought they were way too liberal. but there wasn't anything we could do about it. People higher than us had made the decisions, and we smiled as we cried. In Catholicism, Jesus couldn't possibly have siblings because their dogma dictates that Mother Mary was a perpetual virgin. Virgin before giving birth, virgin after giving birth, and virgin while giving birth. That's their dogma. As such, she couldn't possibly have had any other children, which would include Yahshua if he wasn't the exception. The problem is with dogma. And this is why I have problems with Paul. Not so much about Paul, as about what people, lazy, undedicated, unrighteous, lawless people have done with his dogma in the time of the church, especially from Nicaea and on, 325 and on, because they actively worked not only to destroy the Nazoraeans and the Ebionites, who we'll talk about some other time, but they destroyed their literary works as well. The church destroyed them. Maybe they hid one down in the Catholic vault in Vatican. Maybe they would keep one of them and put it away, and then they would burn the rest or throw them on the trash heap, and the Romans were doing the same thing. This is why we don't have any literature. We don't have much literature from the Apostle Peter, and certainly somebody else wrote those books that are in the New Testament. I'm sorry, but I have to call them Peter Paul because they're not Nazarene in any way, except 2 Peter. I would say that that's very Nazarene. But as for 1 Peter and those Pauline books, he might be called the ringleader of the Nazareans, but his doctrine tells us different. Still, it's a very hard task to separate the Nazareans, the first believers, and the Ebionites later on. But we'll have to do that in another time. Very interesting. So we're going to go on a little bit to the Jerusalem assembly that I just showed you, and the Jewish overseers that we just read about in Malachi Martin. I want you to ask yourself first, who are you? Have you ever thought about that? In Messiah, in the kingdom. You'd think if you get so interested in some of these things in the world that you become addicted to them, addicted to conspiracies, addicted to politics. You might want to call it something else, but really it's an addiction when Yahshua tells us that our eye should be on the sparrow. I want you to consider a quotation from the New Testament. As I read it, please try not to spiritualize it. This is spiritualized all the time in the church, to the point where some in the Hebrew Roots movement today said this book shouldn't even be in the canon. But hear it from a conventional, conversational perspective, as though the speaker was not a theologian, was not a church historian, just somebody trying to make a point to you in the physical. Here it is. You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living Elohim, the Jerusalem in the sky, to an innumerable company of angels, To the general assembly and synagogue of the firstborn, who are registered in the sky tablets. Enoch talks about that. To Elohim, the judge of all creation. You belong to him. You're registered with him. To the spirits of righteous people who have been perfected. To Yahshua, the mediator of the new covenant. And to the sprinkled blood that speaks better things than that of Abel. No, don't think about lofty things here. We have heard so many church sermons that immediately we seem to go into a different mode when we hear something like this. Think physical, think natural now. Make sure that you don't refuse the one who speaks. For if the people who refuse the one who spoke on earth, much more will we fail to escape if we turn away from the one who speaks from the sky, whose voice once shook the earth. Obviously, this writer is talking about earthly life. Now, look, this headquarters, at the time this is written, was still the second floor of David's tomb on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. You just saw some picture of it. Jerusalem being known as the city of the living Elohim, a partaker of the Jerusalem in the sky. And let me ask you, does anyone care to identify the book from which this saying has been extracted? Yes, it's right there. It's in your Bible. Can you bring your mode down from heaven and see what he's saying on earth? I know that you can't remember this anymore. I couldn't either. How could any passage be more Enochian, more Essene than this one? In fact, this was written, in my opinion, to the Essenes. Couldn't be anybody else. Well, this is Hebrews, chapter 12, 22 through 24. Look it up sometime. If you can manage your mind and read this as though it was true right now. And the assembly you're in is on Mount Zion, in the city of the living Elohim. You're a partaker of the Jerusalem in the sky, with an innumerable company of angels in the general assembly of the synagogue of the firstborn, registered in the sky tablets. I think we leave this kind of writing off without realizing it. I mean, we have a choice. We can make this real in our minds and hearts, or we can continue to recite these things and shout amen. Okay. I want you to consider now something that it was mentioned in that quote from Hebrews. That is the assembly on Mount Zion, which on the bottom floor was and is the tomb of David. That the assembly was over the tomb of David is very spiritual. It really tells us about the engrafting of the kingship of David on our Messiah, and also on his people that were created and recreated to be a lot more than we are, to be judged in due time and put in the place that we have been dedicated for all these many years. So this assembly is the location of the Jerusalem Council, which happened from 48 to 50 AD. That's the story from Acts 15. Now, it's based on a true historical document. We can learn a lot about this assembly and even those who were part of it if we look closely at excerpts from Acts 15. And that's what I want to do now. I'm just going to read it through. The Jerusalem Council decision regarding the Gentiles. And certain men came down from Yehuda and were dealing with the brothers. Unless you are circumcised according to the practice of Moshe, you are unable to be saved. Is that true? I ought to know, but I'm not sure. So when Shaul and Barnabas had no small dissensions and disputes with them, I wonder what side Barnabas was on. They arranged for Shaul and Barnabas and certain others to go up to Jerusalem, to the emissaries and elders about this question. And some of the believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees rose up and said, is it necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the Torah of Moshe? I think they probably said, is it not necessary? Verse 7, and when there had been much dispute, they were arguing. Kepha rose up and said to them, men, brethren, you know that a good while ago Elohim chose among us that by my mouth, wait a minute, this is Kepha speaking? That by my mouth, he says, the Gentiles should hear the word of the good news and believe. I thought Shaul was the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, I'm really confused now. And after they were silent, Yaakov answered, saying, how much is Yaakov mentioned in the New Testament? Hardly at all. If you take a look at his letter and compare it with the majority of letters, we find that this guy is really out of step. Yaakov, brother of Yahshua. And even more out of step is that guy named Yehuda, Jude. Think of him quoting apocryphal books that aren't in the Bible, like Enoch, Assumption of Moses, and one more. Yaakov answered, saying, men, brothers, listen to me. Shimeon has declared how Elohim first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. Yeah, Kepha said that he was the apostle to the Gentiles. Therefore, says Yaakov, I judge. Now, who is he to judge anything? He's that guy in John, what is it, chapter 10, that the gospel writer says didn't believe? Is he the one that spoke of his brother as being insane? He says, I judge. Did he, as an Ebionite, just come in and take over the assembly? Wasn't he in a different denomination? I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles, and here's the key, who are turning to Elohim, who are turning. They're in process. They're going through a process. They're going through sanctification, step by step. But that we write to them to abstain from defilements of idols and from whoring and from what is strangled and from blood. There's a lot entailed in those four things. I hear people say, well, the Gentiles only had to do four things or stay away from four things. There's a lot more in that than four things. For from ancient generations, Yaakov continues, Moshe has in every city those proclaiming him, being read in the congregation every Sabbath. Shouldn't it say in here that maybe Yaakov said, first of all, we have to change the Sabbath to Sunday because that's the Lord's day. It says right there in the Revelation. This is in that very building, that same space that we've been looking at. Now, it's interesting that we should see the following taking place after these disputes about circumcision, mainly, and food ordinances. 35, and Shaul and Barnabas continued in Antioch. That was their home base, not Jerusalem. Teaching and bringing with many others also the good news, the word of Yahweh. After some days, Shaul said to Barnabas, let us go now back and visit our brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of Yahweh and see how they are. That's a great thing. And Barnabas proposed to take with them Yochanan, called Marcus. But Shaul thought it not fit to take with them the one who withdrew from them in Pamphylia. This is very lacking of a reason. And Mark, who had not gone with them to the work. A sharp feeling, therefore, came to be so that they parted from one another, Saulus and Barnabas. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. And that's where he was from, so he's going home. And Shaul chose Silas, and went off, being committed by the brothers to the favor of Elohim. I was sure wondering about this. Do you think that their parting and Mark had anything to do with circumcision? Is that possible? Could there have been a dispute between them about these things that were talked of at the council? Then if we go up and look at Galatians chapters 1 through 3, this is exactly what broke up Paul from Cephas and Barnabas. Even Barnabas went with the Jewish, those that came with James. Well, I think that that is a real paradox. And I'd like to sit down with some people that are interested in that and just hear what they have to say, discuss it. And I've been asked, what would you say if a new believer said, well, I'm not circumcised, should I get circumcised? I've had that happen 2 or 3 times. People have asked me. I don't know why they asked me, but I can tell you what my answer was. That is, you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice. That's all up to you. You need to pray. Don't ask me. Ask your Father. Ask the scriptures. And of course, I think a man needs to be circumcised. Of course. It's Torah. We don't have to understand it. No, there's 3 guys that asked me that, including one in this last year. And all 3 of those guys did what I told them to do. Go to prayer, go to the scripture, see what Elohim tells you personally. They all 3 got circumcised, including one of our elders in the Essene. There's another one I know that used to be with us that prayed about this same thing. And then one day at night in his bed, oh, you're not going to believe this. You're not going to believe it. Maybe I shouldn't tell you. Okay, I'll go ahead and tell you, but I'm not going to tell you who, because you probably know him. In his bed, he had a sharp pain in that area. It was such a pain that he had to go inspect it. He'd been circumcised in his sleep. Not a lie. I have his testimony, and I believe it. He was circumcised supernaturally in his sleep. That was his answer. That was his answer. Wow. Miracles can happen. You don't believe it, do you? I'll dig up that testimony. You can hear it yourself. Then you can believe it or not. I won't tell you who it is, though. Now, that leadership of the Jerusalem assembly on Mount Zion certainly lasted for at least 100 years. And then we learned that it lasted another 200 years, at least from 30 AD to 130 AD, up to the Bar Kokhba rebellion. That's called the Second Revolt, Second Jewish Revolt. And that was about 132 AD. And the way I understand it, this was even worse than the revolt of 70 AD. Perhaps after James and Simeon, there became a practice that a relative, a desposynos of Mary, was to take over. I am just going to read these first bishops, these first mivakers of the Jerusalem assembly, just so you can hear the names. James the Just, until 62. Yaakov HaZadik. Simeon the First, that's Simeon Klopa, or Simeon the Zealot. Justus the First, Zadik. This is another guy named James. Zacchaeus. Toviah, a good man of Yah. Benjamin the First. Yochanan the First. Metit Yahu the First. He went up to 120 AD. Philippos, up to 124. Philippos, that is a Greek name, means horse lover. Seneca, Eustace II, or James Zadik. Levi, we don't have dates on these. Ephraim, Yosef the First, and Yehuda. That takes us up to 135, when the new Messiah of the Israelites, Shimon bar Kokhba, or Kosiba, took over, and he had Nazoreans executed, all he could find. He told his armies, kill them when you see them. If they're not going to help us, then they're of no use, no better than worms or trash. So that was the end of the Nazarenes in Jerusalem, because when that war was over and the Romans won it again, they once again spaded Jerusalem completely over and built a whole new city out of it, called it Aelia Capitolina, dedicated to Jupiter, and put a temple to his honor up on the Temple Mount. After that, then the Gentiles took over, and the Nazoreans, they were personae non grata. All right, that's all for tonight, my friends. Is there maybe a question or a comment? Next time, if we come back, we'll be working on the Messianic seal and other issues of this same time period. Talk about Passover? Okay. Yeah, you got it right, Hebrews. Ah, well, Steve, I knew you'd get that. If you read that, tell me if it seems like it's real. A plethora. Okay, plethora. 30 times 30 square meters. Oh, that tells us a lot. Okay, my friends, thank you for coming out. We'll see if we can do this next Tuesday night again. And I really appreciate you coming. Makes me feel like doing it.